I believe that tonight, Yedida Stillman would be particularly delighted with our evening's speaker. I know that Noam and family are, and I know that we had a lot of enthusiasm when we asked around about Professor Aomar Boum, who is the professor of anthropology at UCLA. He's affiliated with the Department of History and the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA. He also serves as Maurice Amato Chair in Sephardic Studies and Director of the Lemuelson Undergraduate Honors Program in Anthropology. A native of the small Saharan community in southeastern Morocco, Boum has interdisciplinary training in anthropology, history, Middle Eastern studies, North African studies, and Judaic studies. His research is focused specifically on the way in which social interactions between these communities have been understood in the historical center, the Middle East, and on the periphery, the sub-Saharan and North African communities. In his field research and publications, Professor Boum has concentrated on the periphery and on the marginal voices as a lens to bring fresh perspectives to dominant discourses on Jewish-Muslim relations. And I must say, getting to know him a little bit today, it's clear that he's as dedicated to teaching as he is to his scholarship, which is about the same as a small department. In addition to Memories of Absence, How Muslims Remember Jews in Morocco, and the Holocaust in North Africa, he has authored 5 books, more than 120 articles, and his most recent publications include Wartime North Africa, a documentary history, and Undesirables, a Holocaust journey through North Africa with artist Najib Berber. Boum is currently working on a book manuscript titled Moroccan Frames, Jewish Portraits, Diasporic Histories from Los Angeles, and co-authored book, Morocco and the Holocaust, the story of Mohammed V, saving the Jews during the World War II, 1940 to 2020. Professor Boum is a member of the Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and is a faculty fellow at the University Internationale de Rabat, Morocco. All in all, we're delighted in the middle of a whole lot of busyness that Professor Boum could come here tonight and speak to us on the topic of jeans, shoes, and bags, how fashion shaped Jewish identity in Los Angeles. Professor Boum. Thanks for the invitation to speak at the 2023 Yedida Stillman Memorial Lecture. Thanks to the Stillman Center for Judaic and Israeli Studies at the University of Oklahoma for the invitation. Special thanks to Alan, to Cassie Shelton, Bryce Heyman, Tom Fenn, Isha Klein, and Claire Nicholas for their welcome. This is a special moment for me, especially even though I have never met Yedida in person, but I got to know her through her husband and other members of the family. I'm presenting for the first time on Moroccan Jews and fashion in honor of her work on dress. Yedida Stillman was a pillar, if not a pioneer, of the history and ethnography of clothing in Arabic and Islamic societies. Based on archival research and documents from the Cairo Geniza, Yedida completed a dissertation under the mentorship of Goitein in 1972. Yedida completed a dissertation under the mentorship of Goitein in 1972 on the wardrobe of Jewish bride in medieval Egypt under the title Female Attire of Medieval Egypt, according to the Trousseau list and cognate material from the Cairo Geniza. The early research in Oriental studies at the University of Pennsylvania triggered long-term fascination with textile, dress, and costumes of the Middle East. Supported by a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, Stillman research
Palestinian costumes and jewelry housed in the Museum of International Folk Art and the International Folk Foundation in Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1979. Yedida published on the costume of Jewish women in Morocco, Palestinian costume and jewelry, female clothing in medieval Egypt, etc., etc. Throughout her work, she underlined the importance of archival material and historical data in the writing of the history of female attire and clothing. This work culminated in a synthesis of her views in a short historical review and survey of Arab attire from the rise of Islam to the present. In Arab Dress, a short history, Yedida situated what she calls Arab clothing as part of what she saw as vestimentary Islamic system. As she was doing her research as a scholar trained in folklore and folk life, studies in the 1960s and early 1970s, her Moroccan Jewish compatriots from Fez, Casablanca, Marrakesh, and other urban and rural mellahs throughout Morocco continued to emigrate to France, Israel, Canada, and the United States. Among these immigrants in Paris, Marseille, Montreal, and Los Angeles, many engaged in the business of schmata, wardrobe, clothing, and fashion. In this presentation, I celebrate the work of Yedida by presenting a general summary of my current ethnographic work on the Moroccan Jewish involvement in the fashion industry by tracing their network between global garment industries or Cité de la Mode, Le Sentier in Paris, Chabanel in downtown Montreal, and downtown LA. Like Yedida, I am interested in situating Moroccan Jews in the landscapes of clothing. Unlike her, I am not interested in Moroccan traditional dress, but in the global Moroccan Jewish networks of fashion in Paris, Milan, Montreal, New York, and Los Angeles. In this short presentation, I used Irving Goffman's metaphorical dramaturgical concept of front stage and backstage to analyze Moroccan Jewish communities' behavior and interactions in the global fashion landscapes of Europe and North America. As early as the 1960s, Moroccan Jews began to participate in the fields of fashion and garments, starting in France before moving to Canada and then the United States. In this setting and during the early stages of their performance in the fashion industry, Moroccan Jews appeared primarily French on the front stage of the global fashion industry. They intentionally used French branding names, spoke French, and purposefully relegated their Moroccanness or Moroccan Jewishness to the backstage. Not that they were ashamed of being Moroccan, but as one informant noted, quote, Moroccanness in these times, or in those times in the 60s and 70s and 80s, was anti-commercial. In this way, end of quote. In this way, Moroccan Jews used the French colonial cultural linguistic capital that they acquired through their schooling in the schools of the Alliance Israélite Universelle as early as the 1860s all the way to the post-independence period, and turned it to their favor as they entered the Canadian and then the American markets of fashion. In the presentation of the self in everyday life, Goffman underlines the importance of setting in the way people perform things. In the global stage of fashion, Moroccan Jews in the United States internalized the norms and expectations of the garment district that they acquired in Paris and refined in Montreal and marketed in Los Angeles. The self-presentation in the market of fashion involves what Goffman calls impression management. Moroccan Jews were not only bringing a new style of clothing different from the regular American garment of the 1970s, 1980s, but they made sure to control how they were perceived by communities of fashion. As newcomers to the stage of fashion, in the early 1980s, they maintained French public image to attain their desired commercial objectives and established their brands in the market through advertisement and sale. Now, I'm going to give a little bit of background to migration. Then what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop reading them, but I'm going to walk you through some of these families there. So Moroccan Jewish jewelry arrived to the United States in small numbers as early as the end of World War II. By the 1980s, the majority settled in New York and Los Angeles after they had spent a period of time in Europe, Israel, France, and Canada, some of them in Latin America. Based on this ethnographic work among Moroccan Jewish communities in Los Angeles, I use here fashion to discuss how what I call the affordness and constraints of the labor market allowed Moroccan Jews, especially as early as the 1980s, to integrate into the local fashion economy. Moroccan Jews, especially those who arrived from France and Canada, reshaped, and I stress here France and Canada because you have to go through France and Canada to get to LA, and I'll explain why. So it reshaped the LA fashion industry by bringing a sophisticated European lifestyle to the American market that was plain, relaxed, and practical. I contend that the connection between fashion and global advertisement, especially photography, and this is a reminder of the Weimar Republic in 1933. There are similar stories here, especially among Moroccan Jews, to play a leading role in strengthening the cultural ties in Greater Los Angeles and giving the community a social and economic visibility in the city, especially post-1990s. I also argue that the connections between family networks and business partnerships were central in strengthening waves of Moroccan immigration in post-2000 to especially arriving from Israel, while expanding indigenous Moroccan religious and cultural institutions in the city. Until recently, and unlike Europe and Latin America, the United States of America was never a popular destination for Moroccan Jewish and Muslim immigrants. Despite the fact that Morocco was the first country to recognize the American independence, only a few Moroccans adventured in the United States. Equally important, and by 1870s, the United States government implemented a restrictive immigration policy through the Immigration Act of 1865, also known as the Page Act. At the moment when Northern Moroccan Jews sought new lives and economic opportunities in the Amazon in the early 1880s and led the new rubber economic enterprise in Belém in Brazil, the United States Immigration Act of 1882 prohibited anyone deemed, and I quote here, convict, lunatic, idiot, or a person unable to take care of himself or herself without becoming a public child, end of quote. At the same time, fees were introduced to limit the immigration of non-citizens and regulate the quota of new arrivals. The end of the African slave arrivals in 1861 and the beginning of the Chinese and Asian immigration after 1848, especially in the West Coast, secured an immigration lifeline for the labor market at a time when immigration preference was relegated to European descendants. It is no coincidence, therefore, that the early Moroccan immigration was linked to a few exceptional individual cases of immigrants who sought the American adventure for specific personal reasons. Unlike the Lebanese immigrants to the United States, Syrian Lebanese, which was largely driven by Christian Maronite communities categorized by the United States federal censuses between 1880 and 1930 as Syria, quote Syria, the Moroccan population was mostly Muslim and Jewish and therefore did not fit the federal immigration religious persecution category. For example, Mustafa Zammouri was one of these cases. Between 1830 and 1839, the American census shows records of four lawful, and I have to go through actually all these records. I found only between 1830 and 1839, the American census shows records of four lawful permanent residents, immigrants described as Moroccan. So, while the record does not point out any classification by religion, Moses Elias Levy, a Moroccan Jew from Mogador, Essaouira, was one of these early immigrants. Actually, they talk about him a little bit, who arrived before the United States started to restrict immigration. Like Zemmouri, Levy is an example of another special case of immigration. Following Jewish persecution in Europe, Levy built a farming collective and enterprise designated for Jewish refugees from anti-Semitism. In 1836, David Levy Ulili, Moses' son, was elected to Florida's Territories Legislative Council, and in 1841, he served as state delegate representing Florida in the United States House of Representatives, and later in the Senate after 1945. 1845. No naturalized Moroccan immigrant was recorded in the census between 1900 and 1930. This might be explained by the restrictions of the 1917 Immigration Act and 1924 Immigration Act, the Johnson-Reed Act. These acts encouraged immigration from Europe, prohibited immigrants from Asia and the Middle East, and enforced quotas by requiring literacy skills and tests. Immigrants from the Northern and Western Europe were given preference in the interwar period. Now, with this background, I want to now walk you through some of these dynamics of how what I call the networks of immigration from France to Canada and the United States, and how they were set in the context of the fashion industry. But before I do that, I want to first of all give you an idea or description of where fashion fits and how the discourse of fashion. If some of you, and Claire is here, some of you who know when there is a French history of costume and wardrobe that goes back, that was basically part of postcards industry. And then, but by the 1930s, probably one of the most important books as far as the fashion is a book by John de Sansonnet. And he traveled throughout southern Morocco between 1933 and 1937. And he wrote this book, and he took pictures, he actually made films about the costumes in Morocco, in that part of in the south. To read this, you have to read this also in the context of what's happening in Morocco in the post 2010 in 2017. Some of the idea of Morocco as a space of costume, as a place of design and clothing design, was also part of the legendary courtier Saint Laurent and his partner Pierre Bourget, who had and this is why you had the idea of the museum of Saint Laurent. But in addition to this culture or this discourse of bringing back Morocco to the center of world status, at least locally, you have a number of French designers and who use this colonial heritage to reproduce a post-Oriental costume, post-Oriental products for household that are part of the fashion, not only in Morocco, but also in Europe and especially France, by using elements of what the French photographer did, and then put them or make them as part of the design. You see them in the streets of Marrakesh, for instance. You see pillows where you take postcards of Moroccan Jews. This is from places like Dibdou, where actually the hometown of one of the key designers, and then they used it to create this selling Morocco through the pre-colonial time. You see them in bags. This is a very famous company. This is what you see in the present. What is happening now in Morocco through French designers or sometimes Moroccan designers. But so what happened in the United States as early as in the 1980s, you start seeing a few American designers who used the image of Morocco in its traditional sense to produce or to launch their own brand. This is the Hayati brand, for instance, by Lisa Adzer, who used this style or elements of Moroccan dress, not in the same way like the kaftan that I'll talk about later, but it took that and then it sold it especially for women, for a particular type of women. Unlike these traditional and local uses of Morocco, the Moroccan Jews or a generation of Moroccan Jews in the 1980s opted for something different. And they opted, as they came to the United States, they tried, as I said, to use French and as a way to make a name in the fashion industry by relying on French the language, by relying on French taste, and so on and so forth, to make sure that they position themselves. And then this began mostly through an experience that started in France, in Paris, in Le Sentier, and from Le Sentier they would come to Canada, where they would refine these traditions. So you can see here in this article, for instance, about one of the key figures that I will mention later. This is a brand called Bisou Bisou, and even the name Kiss Kiss. And then you have an article written in Le Figaro talking about this particular brand, Le Glamour Français à Hollywood. And then it talks about this actually the name, the owner of this brand was born in Casablanca with her husband. But you're priming French, and then you're putting Moroccan on the background. So I already talked about this situation. I talked about the migration that began, as I said, in early after World War II. Some of it went to New York, and most of the people who went to New York were religious as part of the religious migration. The Moroccan migration to LA, it began with the World War II, post-World War II. By 1950s, 1960s, you have a well-established community to the extent that you have the foundation of the first synagogue not only in the West Coast, but in the United States in general, called Em Habanim Sephardic Federation. So this is the context as far as what theoretical framework I'm trying to argue here, and this is the context of this community in this big immigration policies that emerged, that go back to the 19th century all the way to the post-World War II. Now, so the story begins in Le Sentier. Most of these, so Moroccan Jews, even though Moroccan Jews come generally from, the majority of them are connected or related to families who are artisans, or shoemakers, or people who were in the garment, even in Morocco, making shoes and making clothes, or tailors. The definition of a community of designers, a community of fashion designers, began in Paris, in Le Sentier, and in Marseille. Most of these kids came as kids in 30 years old, between 13 and 20 years old. They arrived to Paris. They worked as peddlers. They were in shops, and they learned the taste. Then they would go to Montreal, to Chabanel, and Montreal garment industry. And then this is where you already have the beginning of an established network of brands, Moroccan brands, either in jeans mostly, because the jeans, it was easy to take you have one element and then you can define it, you can add to it. For instance, the Marcianos, the Guess, they would add the zippers in the 80s. That's what made them famous. So every group or every individual would add an element to the jean to make them different from the others. And that's how they sold, and especially given the fact that they already came to a market in the United States where it was totally black. There was nothing really interesting in the American fashion at the time, even despite its development in New York in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And then once you have an established in New York, the reason why Canada was the primary destination, because they would have to buy the joint, they got money to settle, they were allowed to, also you have French help because you were in Quebec, you could All of these elements made the migration easy, made the settlement easy. And they got loans from the government, from the Canadian government. At the time, it was very hard to come to the United States. Once they settled in Canada, mostly in Quebec, then it was later on easy for them to come to LA, with a few exceptions. And then they were also connected, still connected to Milan, and then so you can see even the language when you look. If you are for a linguistic anthropologist to do work on the way they speak to it, so they speak like with an Italian accent, even though they're French, to prime also that idea. So then once you get to the downtown Los Angeles and the garment industry, then you have a different story where you basically expanding the brand. You already have a market in the 80s where you have the television series. We're already helping the marketing for that. So that's the background. Now I want to give this story that I'm trying to tell here is a story of really migration, but it's told through voices of different families. And these different families are connected either to shoes industry, the bags, and the jeans. So I'll start with really one of the most important figures in this business was Bob Ore Abitbol. Bob Ore Abitbol represents this migration line, this chain of migration. He was born in Casablanca. At the age of 21, he goes to, before he got 20, he goes to Paris, where he worked for a cassette seller, and then he spent 2 years in a shop, and then from there he comes to Canada in the early 60s, and he was basically one of the pioneers of the garment industry in Canada, mostly shoes, shirts, jeans, and then he worked also with a Lebanese. This is another interesting thing that you see in Canada and later on in LA, this connection between Lebanese and Tunisian Jews and Moroccan Jews. So for Bob Ore, it's basically his connection to the Lebanese Maronite that actually allowed him to expand his business. Then from there, he became also an important member of the Canadian community, where he was one of the as the Canadian Moroccan Jewish community in Canada was establishing its network and becoming more established in the Canadian society. He was a key figure in this community. You can see some of the pictures here, but so that's one part. And then once you have this establishment, by late 1980s, Bob Ore would settle in LA. The second one is Aldo Ben Sadoun, or the owner of Aldo Shoes. This is but the Ben Sadoun case is unique because it's the only story that actually had to go to the United States, because he was educated in the United States. Then he goes back to Montreal. So you have one story where he began his education. He comes from a family of a shoemaker in Fez. Again, so you can see the connection. Only Fez, Casablanca, generally. This is where the origin comes from. And then he goes to the United States, where he got a training in Cornell. Then and from there, going back to Canada, he worked for the first time for a shoemaker called the Yellow Shoes, very popular shoes in the 70s, before 60s, before he established his own shoe called the Aldo in the 70s. You have also another name. So you have this connection. The shoes and the jeans were the most important in the Canadian market. You have the Buffalo jeans. Buffalo jeans are interesting because they're established by the David Vuitton family, or by David Vuitton. And what's interesting is that this is actually a jean that was started in France, and then they were able to buy the license and then settle in Canada, and it remained in Canada until now. So it's still ongoing. Now, with this Canadian story, and with this establishment of this Canadian story, you start seeing the beginning of a migration of and relocation of these brands to LA. And why LA? For different reasons. The first one, you have to think about, this is why I said it's a migration. All of these brands are following a migration story. In LA, in the 1980s and 1990s, you have the majority of Middle Eastern Jews. You have Iranian Jews, Syrian Jews, Iraqi Jews, Tunisian Jews, and Moroccan Jews. With either a migration, Moroccan Jews are coming from France because of the Mitterrand government. So you have a fear of a socialist government. You have in Iran, you have the post-Iran revolution. And then you have in Syria, all the civil war. So you have all of that flow coming to LA by early 1980s. You already have a majority of names that came from France all the way through LA, and they're already beginning to think about establish their own brand. So Max Azria, the BCBG, already there. You have Uri Arkan from Iraq, and then you have the Paul and Gerard Guest from Tunisia. You have, and in this situation, you start seeing the Moroccans are trying to position themselves, just like the Tunisian, the Iraqis, culturally speaking. So where do you position yourself as a Morocco at the time, as I mentioned before, was not cool, quote unquote. So you already have a concentration of Ashkenazi Jewish community that's involved in the garment industry in LA. And then they're competing with all these new immigrants in the 80s and 90s. And the Moroccans are trying to situate themselves by not calling on their Moroccanness. They are religiously supportive of each other as a Moroccan Jewish community. They're protecting each other. They're proud of their Moroccan Jewish identity. But it's always, I said, going to Goffman's point that I mentioned, it's relegated to the background. So they are fronting the Frenchians. And that's what made them really an essential component, an essential player in this big landscape, in this map of the fashion. One of them is the most important one of the names was very powerful in the 70s, and it's still today, is Jacques Rimaud, the Signal brand. And this is a licensing brand that does all the bags, including them. So you can see him with Jacques as Rimaud with actually Governor Edmond Brown. This is in the 70s. This is how central he's one of the pioneers, one of the early ones. But before he got into the licensing, including all these bags, that he was in charge in many ways of he started a suit company and shirt company called Converse. So that's that. Then the second part, is the Guess brand, the Marciano's brand. The Marciano's brother, the Paul, Maurice, George, and Aomar Marciano. This is one of the few families that started in Marseille, and I'll talk about them later. And it's a family that came from very small areas in Morocco, in Dibdou, city of village in Dibdou, but also in Algeria. So, and then they came through after the Algerian Civil War and Algerian independence. They would come to Marseille, where their father became the main rabbi of Marseille. And then later on, he would become the main rabbi of LA. And then that's where, what you have here, you have a group of 4 brothers who came for an adventure in LA. And then they would come up with a design. Again, the jeans, there is a reason why the jeans, because of you could do a lot of things with jeans, unlike shirts and shoes. And then they would basically create the zipper, the whole zipper. You have these short jeans until the knees, and then you add a zipper to them. That would become one of the most important jeans in the 80s, and especially in the late 70s and 80s. Now, this is where you start seeing the relocation, what we call the relocation. So the Marciano and the Charles Marca, who was involved in the shoe industry as early as the early 70s, will start beginning to create alliances. So you're not only working separately, but you're also partnering with other brands. So once Marciano's established their brand, the Guest brand in LA in the 1980s, you have the Charles Malka, the owner of Charles David Shoes, will join, and then they will create Charles David's LA, where basically now the Marcianos are buying, they start saying buying other companies, using the network that these companies have in terms of the distribution, and then creating bigger companies, and then making sure employing other Moroccans and bringing other Moroccans in them. So you go from 1 to 2 to 3, and then you're expanding that by creating these groups. And part of that, one of them is Joe Joaquin. So one example is, so you have Joe Joaquin was representing a company, a shoe company Charles Malka in LA. And once Charles Malka's brand moved to LA, and then they bought another company that would facilitate the distribution of Charles Malka with the Guest company. Then you would have Joe Joaquin would already knows the market, already knows how the market works, already knows the connection between the retail and the big stores. And that's through those small relations, small network, you're expanding over time what we call the foundation of the community, and as the members grow. So you don't only, and the last thing I want to talk about as far as the genes, you have also, you have a multiplicity of families that would be involved in this. So you have the Orly and Michel Dahan, who's with a company called the Ragtag, and then you have the Jerome and Elsa Dahan. These are separate, even though they have the same family name, but they're separate. They're doing different things, but they're claiming they are really countering on different audiences and different clientele that expand now, that by the late 1980s, early 1990s, expand to other markets. There is another, one of the other interesting groups in this business is women. So women were also part of it. So you have Bisou Bisou, or Marc Michel Bohbot and her husband Marc Bohbot, the owners of Bisou Bisou. So here you have what's interesting about Michel Bohbot, who arrived in the early 1980s. She does not only play on her design expertise, her French skills and taste, and so on and so forth in the fashion industry, but also she plays on that as a mother of 7. So you get into another marketing model where you have now, you're playing on children, that you're a family designer, family fashion expert, and so on and so forth. And then you don't shy away from, in your conversations, in your interviews, in your posters, and so on and so forth, claiming that I'm a mother of 7 children. And then that's also connected to the idea of the Moroccan family, Moroccan community, and so on. So this is in addition to what's by post 2000, you start seeing basically another wave. This is the second part of the second wave of the Moroccan designers who will come to LA, and who will be not only creating a different models of clothing, and but also they would start seeing the mixing. This is the beginning of the mixing of the Moroccan styles, that as well as playing or using different styles at the time that are Mediterranean and Andalusian. So you begin here the focus on also these cultural, the return. This is where Morocco would start moving slowly from the backstage to the front stage. Now that this landscape is set, now you get to what we call the mainstreaming. And the mainstreaming now becomes setting up connections and setting up relations with big stores like JCPenney, all the major stores, Macy's. So you go from these small, now they're not talking about small retailers, small shops. or small stores in different cities, but then now you're going to the mainstream by bringing the price from the $100 to $20 or $25. And in doing that, one of the most important tools, this is, you see this in, there are elements of this in what we call, if you look at the Weimar Republic, a lot of women photographers in Jewish, especially Jewish women photographers, were key in basically the expansion of the fashion, quote unquote, Jewish fashion, quote unquote, in 1918, from 1918 to early 1930. In the case of Moroccan Jews, probably one of the really most important thing that happened is the Paul Marciano's genius as far as the marketing through black and white photography. But not only but also using what he call guest girls, or the whole business of sexy, beautiful, quote unquote, women and all the industry of advertising. And then they were basically the ones who discovered all of these. So you start with Claudia Schiffer and Anna Nicole Smith. They're probably one of the most important symbols of advertisement, and they were discovered by Morocco. They were discovered by this especially the Paul Marciano is still, and that's what really made the Guess jeans an American jean. It's not now, if you think about that, there is really, when you think about how it's advertised, it's really through that. So, and then you get not only through that, but then you use other from the 1980s, late 80s, 1990s, you have names like Noah Campbell, Jennifer Lopez. This is recent. This is their last publicity drive. Is that it becomes an American. They're not actually catering to other market, although they exist in a lot of, but it's defined as an American market, as an American product. So that's what's happening in the front stage. Okay, now I'll take you to the backstage. Backstage is Moroccan traditional Judaism. You have a lot of Moroccan Jewish synagogues in LA, probably between 8 to 10 synagogues, very vibrant synagogue. The scholars, you have like Rabbi Labhar, for instance, one of the most important scholars today in Judaism in Morocco, in global Judaism, I would say. Very refined scholars. You have also these synagogues are training and educating Moroccan Jewish youth and the tradition of Moroccan Judaism, and they are living and dying through Moroccan Judaism. So you have a Moroccan Jewish cemetery. So I spend a lot of time in cemeteries and in synagogues, and then you have in their celebration, the annual celebration of, you have, they're still learning Moroccan Judaism, and then you can see the names of the, what's interesting here, you see all of these brand owners, these designers, they're also very implicated in their own Judaism. They're funding synagogues. They are making sure that you have their communities, members of the community that are supported, and so on. So you have, for instance, the Jacques Rimo is donating this Sefer Torah to the Em Habanim, for instance. You have them here connected to Morocco. So the idea of Morocco for them is central. So in their annual celebrations, you can see the Moroccan Zalij, you can see elements of Moroccan cities and architecture, and so in the way they present themselves in their ritual, in the daily and annual ritual. And then you have the way also the support. So you see Bizo, for instance, how they're supporting annual fund drives, supporting, raising money for the community. And even in the halls of the synagogue, when you go through the halls, you see the names that I'm talking about, that I already talked about in the front stage. And then their connection, you have partly their connection to the Moroccan monarchy. This is also part of being Moroccan, is how they see themselves as a community that's connected to the Moroccan monarchy, and They talk about it in their prayers, praying for the sultans and the kings and so on. So that's something that's still lived, and you see it, you hear it in Shabbats, you hear it in annual festivals and so on. The next point I want to talk about here is that when you look at these communities, you think that there is a separation between a Moroccan Jewish community and a Tunisian or Iraqi or Lebanese or Egyptian. That's actually, when you look at the background, they are also in the synagogues or you have a lot, at least the religious leadership is also connecting with other members of the community, including these groups that I talked about. So you have the relationship to the Azariyas, the relationship to the owners of the Jonathan Martins, and all of these shows that there is still some connection at the grand Sephardic level. So there is a unique element that makes them Moroccan, but there is also a form of another partnership to the Sephardic community, the Tunisians, the Egyptians, the Lebanese, and so on. Now, what is the future? So every time you think about in Jewish, there is also, you talk about the future. So if you look at the majority of the migrants that came to LA, unlike Canada, they're not educated. They don't have a PhD university. They're mostly in the fashion industry. So that started to change, where more and more fashion designers and people were pushing their kids to seek other professions instead of fashion. But you still have some names that maintain this. And then so the Marciano, for instance, you have Nicola Marciano, one of the sons of Paul Marciano. They're creating their own brand for the Jay-Z. And then you have another Eli Azran, one of the key fashion designers. And of course, Albert Elbaz, who just died recently in 2015, post of COVID. But he's more of the other Israeli French part of it. And unlike what I said at the beginning, before I close here, in terms of how Moroccanness, the traditional Moroccan dress, is marketed in the global scene, the kaftan is returned. And this is a huge shift. So what you see here is a shift from this Oriental discourse that is taken, or that's tried to push away anything that comes from the French. I think Claire talks a lot about in her work on garment. And then you see the return of the kaftan as a global product, as a global fashion product. And it's done by Moroccans, Moroccan Jews and non-Moroccan. So you have, for instance, Van Damme, Marie-France Van Damme is not Moroccan, in Canada, mostly she has her own kaftan. But the most important story is actually Albert Waknin. And what Albert Waknin did, which reminds us of the return to what I call the Moroccan identity on a global stage, is that he's not building his store in Paris, or in LA or in New York, even though he does shows but his store is in Casablanca. And through Casablanca, he is projecting a Moroccan, Jewish, Andalusian, Amazigh identity, global identity. And I think that what Yedida worked on. And I think Yedida would approve that Albert Waknin is doing what he's doing today. Thank you.